There is a silence that clings to the dust of Mesopotamia, a chilling, wordless void where the voices of the gods once thundered. For thousands of years, the Anunnaki ruled from the heights of their gold-capped ziggurats, shaping the clay of humanity and decreeing the fates of empires. And then they were gone. No final battle. No celestial farewell. Only an empty temple and a slow, haunting fade into the realm of shadows and myth. Tonight, we journey beyond the crumbling walls of Uruk to uncover the true fate of the beings who from heaven to earth came. Did they return to the stars, or did they simply dissolve into the shifting currents of human memory? Before we begin, ignite that like button. Tell me in the comments what time it is where you are. Prepare your mind. Let us descend into the mystery. The silence that hangs over the mounds of Mesopotamia is not merely the absence of sound. It is a weight. It is a heavy, lingering residue of a conversation that ended thousands of years ago, leaving humanity to wait for a reply that never came. When you walk through the dust of what was once the city of Nippur, the religious heart of the ancient world, you are walking through the wreckage of divine abandonment. The great temple of Enlil, known as the E-Kur or the Mountain House, was once believed to be the literal mooring point between the heavens and the earth. It was the place where the king of the gods sat in council, where the fates of nations were whispered into the clay. But today, it is a series of sun-bleached ridges, a skeletal remain of a belief system that once commanded the total devotion of millions. The question we must ask ourselves as we stand in this wasteland is simple yet terrifying. When did the gods stop walking the streets? There was no single day when the Anunnaki announced their departure. There is no tablet that records a final flight or a closing of the celestial gates. Instead, what we find is a slow, agonizing transition from presence to absence. In the earliest Sumerian periods, the gods were treated as physical, breathing realities. They had houses that required cleaning. They had bodies that required feeding. They had moods that could be felt in the humidity of the air or the sudden shift of the river. But as the centuries stretched into millennia, something changed. The god began to retreat. They moved from the inner sanctums of the temples to the distant heights of the stars, leaving behind a world that felt increasingly cold and increasingly alone. To understand what happened to the Anunnaki after they left Earth, we must first look at the evidence of their withdrawal. In the archaeological record, we see a shift in the way temples were constructed and managed. In the dawn of the 3rd millennium BCE, the temple was the center of everything. It was a household where the deity lived as a supreme landlord. The priests were not just religious practitioners. They were domestic servants to a living king. But as we move toward the Babylonian and Assyrian eras, the relationship becomes more abstract. The gods are no longer seen as residents of the city. They become transcendent. They become names invoked in prayer, rather than masters served at a table. This is the first clue in our investigation. The Anunnaki did not leave in a single moment of fire and thunder. They faded. They withdrew their presence from the material world, moving into the realm of the hidden and the symbolic. Mainstream historians will tell you that this was a natural evolution of religious thought. They argue that as human societies became more complex and more skeptical, they move away from the literal, physical gods of their ancestors toward a more sophisticated, invisible divinity. But this academic explanation ignores a profound sense of loss that permeates the ancient texts. The Sumerians did not feel they were evolving towards something better. They felt they were being left behind. In the great city of Ur, during the final days of its glory, we find laments written on tablets that speak of the gods abandoning their shrines like birds flying from their nests. They describe the divine spirit leaving the city, leaving it vulnerable to the storms and the swords of invaders. This was not a theological progress. It was a cosmic trauma. Consider the role of the king. In the earliest days, the king was merely the steward of the god. He ruled because the deity was physically present in the city to authorize his reign. But as the Anunnaki retreated, the kings had to find new ways to justify their power. They began to claim they had been chosen in a dream, or that they possessed a divine bloodline that traced back to a time when the gods were still among us. This shift in political authority is a direct reflection of the physical absence of the Anunnaki. If the gods were still here, if they were still sitting in their council chambers in Nippur or Uruk, there would be no need for these elaborate justifications. The kingship became a substitute for the divine presence, a way for humanity to govern itself in a world where the masters had gone silent. But where did they go? If we follow the logic of the ancient astronaut theory, the answer is literal. They returned to the stars. They boarded their celestial barks and ascended to the station of Anu, leaving Earth behind as a completed project or a failed experiment. Proponents of this theory point to the sudden collapse of the Sumerian civilization around 2000 BCE as the moment of departure. They suggest that a great conflict among the Anunnaki led to the use of terrifying weapons, referred to in the text as the evil wind or the weapons of terror, which rendered the cities uninhabitable and forced the gods to evacuate. They look at the descriptions of the gods flying in winged discs and ascending in pillars of fire, and see the technical records of a spacefaring race. Yet, if we look closer at the tablets, a more complex picture emerges. The departure was not just a physical movement, but a change in the frequency of human interaction. The term Anunnaki itself began to take on a darker, more distant meaning. In the later Babylonian periods, the Anunnaki were no longer the vibrant rulers of the sky. They became the judges of the underworld, the silent watchers of the dead. This is one of the most mysterious transformations in religious history. Why would the princely offspring of the sky gods be relegated to the realm of shadows? Some scholars suggest this was a way for the later cultures to pack away the old gods. By moving them into the underworld, they kept them relevant as judges of morality, but ensured they were no longer active players in the world of the living. It was a theological retirement. But there is a third possibility, one that bridges the gap between the material and the mystical. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not leave because they wanted to. Perhaps they were forced out by a change in the spiritual environment of our world. Throughout the history of Mesopotamia, we see the rise of newer, more aggressive gods. Marduk in Babylon and Ashur in Assyria were not like the older Anunnaki. They were singular, jealous, and demanded total supremacy. They absorbed the functions of the older gods, stealing their myths and their titles until the original council was left with nothing but their names. In this view, the Anunnaki did not fly away in rockets. They were consumed by their own descendants. They were eaten by the very religious systems they helped create. Imagine the last priest of a dying temple in a city that the gods had forgotten. He still performs the rituals. He still cleans the statue and offers the bread and the beer, but he feels nothing. The air is still. The statue is just stone. The me, the divine decrees that once hummed through the city like an electric current, have gone dormant. This is the true end of the Anunnaki on Earth. It is not a blast off into the clouds. It is the moment the last person who truly knew them died, leaving behind only the rituals and the stones. We see this process of forgetting in the evolution of the cuneiform script itself. Writing began as a way to record the activities of the gods and their estates. It was a sacred technology. But by the time of the Persian conquest, it had become a tool for tax collectors and bureaucrats. The magic had drained out clay. When the ability to read the ancient tablets was finally lost in the early centuries of the Common Era, the Anunnaki were not just gone, they were erased. They became the dust of the ziggurats, buried under layers of sand and the footprints of new civilizations that had no memory of the beings who had once shaped their world. Tonight, we are digging through that dust. We are attempting to reconstruct the final days of a divine era. To understand the departure of the Anunnaki, we must look at the shifting stars. The ancients were obsessed with the movements of the planets because they believed these were the literal paths of the gods. When the texts speak of God ascending, they often correlate this with a specific astronomical event. Could it be that the Anunnaki tied their presence on Earth to a celestial cycle that eventually moved out of alignment? Did they leave because the heavens themselves changed? There is a haunting passage in an old Babylonian text that speaks of the gods becoming like flies, swarming around the sacrifice because they were starving. It is an image of desperation. It suggests that toward the end, the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity had broken down. We were no longer providing the energy or the devotion they required to remain anchored in our reality. We had become too noisy, too chaotic, and too numerous. Just as the Atrahasis myth tells us, the gods once tried to wipe us out with a flood because we disturbed their sleep. Perhaps their ultimate departure was the final solution to the problem of human clamor. They didn't destroy us. They simply turned off the lights and left the room. But the room is not empty. The structures they built still stand. The words they whispered still echo in the grammar of our languages and the laws of our societies. As we move deeper into this investigation, we will look at the specific regions where the gods were last seen. We will look at the records of the city of Haran, where the moon god was worshipped long after the rest of the world had turned to new faiths. We will look at the mysterious visions of the prophets who claimed to see the glory of the gods departing from the temples in chariots of fire. And we will ask the most important question of all. If they left, did they leave a way back? Is the silence of the ziggurats a permanent state, or is it a pause in a much longer conversation? You are standing now at the base of the great ziggurat of UR. The wind is picking up, stinging your eyes with the fine silt of the Mesopotamian plain. This structure was designed to be a staircase. It was a machine for vertical movement. As you look up at the crumbling terraces, you realize that the story of the Anunnaki is the story of our own reach for the infinite. Whether they were flesh and blood extraterrestrials or the projections of a brilliant and terrified ancient mind, their departure marked the end of our childhood as a species. They were the parents who walked out, leaving us with the keys to the kingdom and a set of instructions we can no longer fully translate. The final ascent was not just theirs. It was the moment humanity was forced to stand on its own feet, looking up at a sky that was suddenly, and perhaps forever, empty. But the dust is still settling. And in that dust, there are patterns. There are names. There are truths that are waiting to be brushed clean. Let us look closer at the records of the final days. Let us see what the scribes saw as the shadows lengthened over the world of the two rivers. Let us follow the trail of the gods into the stars and into the dark. To look up at the night sky over the ancient city of Babylon was to gaze into a map of the divine. For the scribes and the priests who watched from the high terraces of the ziggurats, the stars were not distant balls of hydrogen and plasma, but the shining script of the gods themselves. Every movement of a planet, every flicker of a star, was a letter in a cosmic language that dictated the rise and fall of kings. But there's a specific region of that sky that held a particular terror and fascination for the ancient watchers. It is a place where the great celestial river, the Milky Way, seems to split in two, a jagged, black void that tears through the center of the shimmering band of light. Modern astronomers call it the Great Rift or the Cygnus Rift. It is a massive cloud of interstellar dust that obscures the light of the stars behind it, creating a dark highway through the heart of our galaxy. But to the ancients, this was the dark rift. This was the gate. This was the entrance to the long cold. If we are to understand what happened to the Anunnaki after they left the surface of our world, we must follow them here into the silence of the void. We must imagine a moment when the physical presence of the divine ceased to be an earthly reality and became a celestial memory. This is the story of the long cold, the period of transit and silence that followed the departure of the gods. It is a story that bridges the gap between the tangible mud bricks of Mesopotamia and the cold, vast distances of the outer solar system. To understand the journey, you must first understand the celestial geography of the ancient world. The Sumerians did not see the sky as a random collection of lights. They divided the heavens into 3 great paths, each belonging to one of the primary Anunnaki gods. There was the path of Enlil in the northern sky, the path of Anu along the celestial equator, and the path of Ea in the southern reaches. These were the highways of the gods, the lanes through which their celestial boats were thought to travel. When the texts speak of the gods ascending, they are describing a movement along these specific trajectories. But the dark rift represented something else entirely. It was seen as a crossing point, a threshold between the world of the living and the world of the eternal. It was the place where the celestial boats would enter the deep waters of the cosmic ocean. In the ancient astronaut framework, this rift is reinterpreted as a gravitational gateway or specific navigational corridor that allowed for transit out of the inner solar system. Whether you view it through the lens of myth or the lens of speculation, the significance remains the same. It is the point of no return. It is the moment when the light of the temple fires fades into the distance and the long cold begins. The long cold is more than just a physical distance. It is a theological and psychological epic for the humans left behind in the dust of the Fertile Crescent. The departure of the Anunnaki meant a fundamental change in the texture of reality. Imagine the psychological shock of a civilization that had been built on the principle of direct divine supervision suddenly finding itself alone. For thousands of years, the Anunnaki had been the administrators of the world. They were the ones who decreed the fates, who managed the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, who provided the blueprints of the first cities. Their presence was a guarantee of order. When they withdrew into the dark rift, they took that guarantee with them. What remained was the long cold of human responsibility. This transition is reflected in the archaeological record by a subtle but unmistakable shift in the nature of prayer and ritual. The early hymns are conversations, direct appeals to a present and active deity. The later texts are lamentations, cries for help directed toward a silent sky. The gods had moved beyond the reach of human voices. They had entered the transit, the long journey back to the dwelling of the Father, Anu. In the controversial theories of Zacharias Sitchin and his successors, this departure was not a spiritual ascension, but a physical evacuation. They point to the cyclical nature of the Mesopotamian calendar, which was based on the movements of the heavenly bodies, as evidence of a scheduled departure. They argue that the Anunnaki operated on a time scale that was vastly different from our own, tied to the long, elliptical orbit of their home world. As that world moved away from the sun, heading back into the deep reaches of the outer solar system, the window for travel began to close. The gods had to leave or be stranded on a planet that was increasingly becoming a backwater in their cosmic empire. They boarded their celestial craft, the Ma'ana, and rose into the atmosphere, leaving behind the ziggurats and the temples that had served as their houses. As they moved further away, the signals of their presence began to attenuate. The divine decrees, the me, which had been the source of all civilization, began to degrade like a fading radio transmission. This is a mechanical reality of the long cold. It is the loss of the signal. It is the beginning of the great silence. But what did this journey look like from the perspective of the departing gods? To answer this, we must look at the Mesopotamian descriptions of the Abzu of the heavens. While the earthly Abzu was a realm of fresh water beneath the ground, the heavenly Abzu was a vast, dark expanse of space. It was described as a place of terrifying silence and immense scale. The texts speak of the gods traveling in boats that shone like the sun, moving to the stars as if through a great sea. They describe the beauty and the horror of the void. If we take these descriptions literally, we see a picture of a species navigating the dark rift of the Milky Way, heading toward a destination that lay far beyond the reach of human eyes. The long cold was the environment they inhabited for centuries as they made their way back to the outer darkness. For them, Earth was a project that had reached its conclusion, or perhaps a colony that had become too difficult to manage. They left us with the tools of civilization, the seeds of agriculture and the structures of law, and then they turned their backs on the sun. This period of transit is perhaps the most mysterious part of the Anunnaki story. It is the blank space on the map. While the gods were navigating the dark rift, humanity was left to interpret their absence. This is where we see the rise of the great priesthoods and the bureaucratization of religion. When the gods were present, they were the law. When they were gone, the priests became the keepers of the memory of the law. They developed complex systems of divination and omen reading to try and catch any lingering echoes of the divine signal. They watched the stars with an intensity that bordered on desperation, hoping for a sign that the gods were still watching, still caring, still listening. But the heavens remained cold. The dark rift did not open again. The long cold of the transition period stretched from decades into centuries, and from centuries into millennia. The memory of the actual beings began to blur into the concept of the gods. The physical reality of the Anunnaki was replaced by the theological structure of the Mesopotamian pantheon. Consider the impact of this silence on the evolution of human thought. When the gods were active participants in the world, there was no need for faith. You did not believe in Enlil, you serve him. You did not have faith in Inanna, you witness her power in the fury of the battle and the passion of the heart. But in the long cold of their absence, belief became a necessity. Human beings had to convince themselves that the silence was not abandonment, but a test or a part of divine plan that was too large for them to comprehend. This is the moment when the sacred moved from the earth to the sky. It is the moment when the gods became transcendent, no longer dwellers in a local temple. They became the masters of the stars, the dwellers in the unreachable heights. The dark rift was no longer a highway for travel, but a barrier that protected the divine from the mundane. This shift is encoded in the shifting language of the tablets. We see a transition from the Sumerian records of direct interaction to the Babylonian epics of cosmic struggle. The gods are no longer walking in the gardens of Eridu. They are fighting dragons in the primordial chaos of the deep. They are organizing the constellations and setting the paths of the sun and the moon. They have become architects of the universe rather than administrators of the city. The long cold had transformed them. In the eyes of humanity, they had grown larger and more distant. They had become the unreachable architects. And yet, the longing for their return remained the central theme of the entire religious tradition. The ziggurats continued to be maintained, the offerings continued to be presented, and the beds and summit shrines were still made every night, just in case a celestial boat should emerge in the dark rift and bring the gods back to their earthly home. The astrophysical reality of the dark rift adds a layer of eerie resonance to this story. When we look at the Milky Way, we are looking at the edge of our own galaxy. The dark clouds of the rift are actually massive nurseries of stars, places where the gravity and the dust are coming together to create new suns. It is a place of birth and death on a scale that defies imagination. If the Anunnaki were indeed navigating this region, they were moving through the very heart of the cosmic engine. The long cold was not just an empty void, but a place of immense potential and hidden power. The Mesopotamian priests may have sensed this. Their descriptions of the heavens are filled with a sense of awe that is not just religious, but almost scientific in its appreciation of scale. They recognized that the sky was not just a ceiling, but a depth, and it was into that depth that their creators had vanished. As the millennia passed, the silence of the long cold began to take its toll on the civilizations of Mesopotamia. The political stability that had been maintained by the divine mandate began to crumble. Kings could no longer claim to have spoken directly with the gods. Instead, they had to rely on the interpretations of priests and the authority of tradition. The connection was fraying. The dark rift was getting wider. This is a period when we see the rise of the great empires of Assyria and Babylon, cultures that were obsessed with power and conquest as a way of filling the void left by the gods. They built larger and larger temples. They compiled more and more detailed records of the stars, but they could not bring back the physical presence of the Anunnaki. They were living in the twilight of the gods, the cold afterglow of a golden age that had passed into the stars. The long cold also forced a new kind of introspection on humanity. In the absence of direct divine guidance, we had to look to ourselves for the answers to the great questions of life and death. This is the era of the first great wisdom literature, the poems and the dialogues that struggle with the problem of suffering and the meaning of existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the quintessential product of the long cold. It is a story about a man who is a drop of divine blood, but is forced to live in a world where the gods are capricious and death is certain. Gilgamesh's journey to the ends of the earth to find the secret of immortality is a journey through the psychological landscape of the long cold. He is searching for a connection to the eternal that has been lost. When he fails, he is forced to find meaning in the walls he has built and the city he has ruled. He is the first modern man, the one who realizes that the gods have left the world to us. Tonight, as we navigate the dark rift of our own history, we are still living the echoes of that departure. We are still looking up at the same stars, still wondering about the same void, still asking the same questions that were first etched into clay 4,000 years ago. The story of what happened to the Anunnaki after they left Earth is not just a mystery of the past. It is a mirror for our own future. It forces us to confront the possibility that we are a species that was started and then left to find our own way. It challenges us to look at the dark rift not as a place of terror, but as a horizon of possibility. Whether the gods were literal travelers in the stars or metaphors for our own awakening consciousness, their departure marks the beginning of the human story. The long cold is the space where we became who we are. It is the distance we have traveled since we stopped being servants and started being masters of our own destiny. The trail of the gods leads us deeper into the stars, into regions of the galaxy, where the light of our sun is just another flickering point in the darkness. It leads us to the heart of the mystery of why they left and where they might be now. But as we follow that trail, we must also look back at what they left behind. We must look at the structures they built and the knowledge they imparted, and we must ask ourselves if we are ready for the possibility that the silence is coming to an end. The dark rift is still there, tearing through the light of the Milky Way, a silent reminder of the highway of the gods. And a long cold still waits for anyone who dares look beyond the atmosphere of our small, blue world. We are the inheritors of the silence. We are the children of the long cold. And the story of the Anunnaki is the map we use to find our way through the dark. Keep your eyes on the stars, for the script is still being written, and the rift may yet open once again. To imagine the Anunnaki returning to a home world is to imagine a kingdom not in celebration, but in a state of profound and destabilizing flux. If we follow the logic of the ancient texts and the interpretations that suggest a withdrawal, we must ask what kind of society were they returning to. The Sumerian records do not describe a static paradise. They describe a complex, often litigious, and deeply hierarchical divine bureaucracy. When the gods supposedly stepped away from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the fertile plains of the Tigris and Euphrates, they were not merely going home. They were returning to a celestial system that had been fundamentally altered by their long absence and their complicated relationship with humanity. This is the story of Nibiru reclaimed, a narrative of a royal house divided and a cosmic order in the midst of a slow, agonizing transformation. To understand this flux, we must first look at the concept of kingship, as the Anunnaki defined it. In the Sumerian worldview, kingship was something that descended from heaven. It was a tangible authority, governed by the me, those mysterious divine decrees that acted as the operating system for civilization itself. When the High Council of the Anunnaki, the great gods who decree the fates, returned to their own realm, they brought with them the experience of millions of years of earthly administration. They were no longer just the sky gods of old. They were the architects of a biological and social experiment that had grown beyond their control. This created tension within their own ranks, a rivalry that the text suggests was never truly resolved. At the heart of this kingdom in flux was the eternal shadow of the conflict between two brothers, Enlil and Enki. Their rivalry is the foundational drama of the Anunnaki narrative, and it did not end when they left the shores of the Persian Gulf. Enlil, the lord of the wind and the champion of the old order, had always viewed humanity as a noisy, unpredictable distraction. His desire was for a return to the purity of the divine realm, a reclamation of Nibiru that was free from the clamor of the hybrid species they had manufactured. To Enlil, the withdrawal from Earth was a long overdue correction, a way to restore the silence and the strict hierarchy of the royal bloodline. But Enki, the god of wisdom and the master of the freshwater deeps, represented a different faction. He was the one who had saved humanity from the flood, the one who had infused the clay of earth with the blood of a god to create a being capable of intelligence. For Enki, the kingdom of Nibiru could never truly be the same after Earth. He carried with him the knowledge of the creation, the bond between the creator and the manufactured. The flux in the kingdom was not just political. It was existential. It was a debate over the very definition of their species. Were they solitary masters of the cosmos, or were they now part of a larger, interconnected web of life that included the very beings they had left behind? This internal struggle is reflected in how the later Babylonian texts, like the Enuma Elish, reorganized the divine hierarchy. As the center of power shifted on Earth from Uruk and Uar to Babylon, the stories of the gods change to reflect a new, more centralized authority. Marduk, the son of Enki, rose to the position of supreme lord, claiming 50 names and the authority of the older generation. This transition represents a significant moment of flux. The older gods, the original Anunnaki who had first ascended, were being pushed into the background. They were becoming the retired generation, the ancestors who were honored but no longer held the reins of daily power. This mirrors the archaeological reality we find in the ruins of the ancient world. Just as the earthly kings sought to legitimize their rule by claiming the mantle of those who came before, the divine kingdom was undergoing a process of consolidation. The 600 Anunnaki mentioned in the Babylonian creation myths were divided into those of the heavens and those of the underworld. This division is a key piece of the puzzle. It suggests that as they withdrew, their society became more specialized, more distant from the physical reality of the planet they had once governed. They were retreating into the structures of their own making, a cosmic bureaucracy that was becoming increasingly abstract and removed from the lived experience of the mortals who still looked up at the stars. The term Nibiru itself adds another layer of complexity to this kingdom in flux. While modern speculation often envisions it as a physical planet on a massive elliptical orbit, the actual astronomical records of the Babylonians treat it with a different kind of reverence. In the Mo'apin, an ancient compendium of stars and constellations, Nibiru is described as a point of transition, a crossing. It is the place where the celestial paths meet, the point of the winter solstice, or the star of Marduk that maintains the order of the heavens. If the Anunnaki reclaimed Nibiru, they were reclaiming a position of cosmic observation. They were positioning themselves at the crossroads of the universe, a vantage point from which they could monitor the unfolding of the fates without being directly seen. This withdrawal into a state of flux allowed for the emergence of a new kind of religious consciousness among humans. As the gods became less visible, as their direct interventions became rarer and more encoded in signs and omens, the nature of worship changed. The intimacy of the early Sumerian period, where a god might walk into a temple and share a meal, was replaced by the grand, silent rituals of the later empires. The gods were now in the kingdom beyond, a place of flux and reorganization that was accessible only through the most elaborate and secret of rites. But we must ask, what was the price of this reclamation? When a ruling class withdraws from its territory, a vacuum is created on Earth. This vacuum was filled by kings who claimed to be the shadow of the god, rulers who use the memory of the Anunnaki to justify their own absolute power. In the divine realm, the flux likely meant a loss of the very thing that had made the Earth Project so vital. The challenge of managing a biological world, of dealing with the unpredictable nature of human emotion and growth, had provided a purpose that the static halls of a reclaimed Nibiru could not match. The text suggests that even in their absence, the Anunnaki remained deeply concerned with the maintenance of the me. These divine blueprints for everything from the art of the smith to the office of the priest remained the essential link between the kingdom in flux and the world they had left. The flux was perhaps a process of digitizing or distilling their influence. They were moving from a physical presence to a systemic one. They were no longer the kings on the throne, but the laws that made the throne possible. This transition from physical masters to hidden architects is where the story of the Anunnaki becomes truly haunting. It forces us to reconsider the nature of their departure. If they were in a state of flux, it means they were not finished. It means the kingdom was still being built, still being argued over, still being refined. The disappearance of the gods in the ancient records was not a final act, but a change in frequency. They were moving into the deep background of human history, a move that required a complete restructuring of their own society. Consider the role of the Igigi, the lower tier of deities who had famously revolted against the labor of digging canals. When the Anunnaki reclaimed their kingdom, what happened to this working class of gods? Did they return to a life of service? Or had the creation of humanity permanently changed their status? The flux would have extended to every level of their hierarchy. The social contract of the gods had been broken and rewritten on Earth, and those changes would have traveled back with them, creating a society that was struggling to integrate the lessons of their earthly stay. The archaeological record gives us a glimpse of this transition through the evolution of the ziggurat. These structures grew larger and more complex, even as the gods they were built for became more distant. This paradox suggests that as the Anunnaki moved deeper into their own internal flux, humanity felt an even greater need to reach out to them. We were building larger antennas for a signal that was becoming increasingly faint. The ziggurat of Babylon, the Anunnaki, was the ultimate expression of this desire to bridge the gap between a world in decline and a kingdom in flux. We must also confront the possibility that the kingdom they reclaimed was not a physical world at all, but a state of being. The Sumerian word for heaven, and is the same as the name of the supreme sky god. To return to heaven was to return to the source of consciousness, to a realm of pure information and decree. The flux, then, was the process of the Anunnaki reintegrating their physical experiences into a non-physical existence. They were becoming the myths they had created. They were merging with the very archetypes they had established. This brings us to a profound realization about the nature of the Anunnaki after they left. If their kingdom was in flux, it means they were still evolving. The ancient astronaut theory often treats them as a static, technologically advanced race that simply moved from point A to point B. But the mythological record suggests something far more organic and psychological. They were a civilization in the midst of a great transition, perhaps even a great crisis. The decision to leave Earth may not have been a choice made from a position of strength, but a necessity born of their own internal instability. The shadows of this flux are visible in the way the ancient Near Eastern world eventually moved toward monotheism. The many gods who were in conflict, the brothers who fought, the council that debated, all eventually gave way to the idea of a single transcendent authority. This reflects a final resolution of the flux, a consolidation of the divine kingdom into a form that was so distant and so absolute that the names of the individual Anunnaki were no longer needed. They had become the one, the hidden mover, the silent architect. Tonight, as we look at the crumbling mud bricks of Uruk and the silent stars above, we are looking at the two ends of a bridge that was long ago dismantled. The Anunnaki reclaimed their kingdom, but in doing so, they left us with the pieces of a puzzle that we are still trying to solve. The flux in their kingdom mirrored the flux in our own, as we struggle to understand our place in a universe that once had visible masters. They left us with the me, the laws of civilization, and the enduring memory of their presence, a memory that has transformed from history into myth and now into the modern speculation that brings us here tonight. Before we move into the final revelations of what this departure means for our future, take a moment to consider the silence of the temples. That silence is not a sign of absence, but a sign of a relationship that has changed form. The kingdom in flux is still out there, at the crossing point of the heavens, watching the unfolding of the fates they once decreed. The Anunnaki did not just leave. They became the invisible structure of our world, a kingdom in flux that continues to shape our reality from the shadows of the deep past. Prepare yourselves, for we are about to descend into the final mystery. The question of whether the flux is finally reaching its conclusion, and what happens to humanity when the gates of that reclaimed kingdom swing open once again. If you look at the history of human obsession, one element stands above all others in a way that defies logical explanation. Gold. It is a soft yellow metal. In the early days of our species, it had almost no practical use for survival. You could not eat it. You could not forge a strong blade from it. It was too heavy to carry easily and too rare to use for common tools. Yet, for thousands of years, every major civilization on this planet has bled, conquered, and died to possess it. We treat it as if it holds the very essence of value itself. The ancient astronaut theory suggests that this obsession is not actually ours. It is a lingering echo, a genetic memory of a purpose we were designed for but have long since forgotten. We are told by theorists like Zacharias Sitchin that the Anunnaki did not come here to be gods. They did not come here to build a civilization for us. They came because their own world, the elusive Nibiru, was dying. They came to mine gold because gold was the only thing that could save their atmosphere. This brings us to the very heart of their departure. If the Anunnaki truly left Earth, did they leave because the mission was accomplished? Or did they flee a project that had become a cosmic failure? Before we descend into the dark minds of the ancient world, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. We love hearing from our global community as we piece together these fragments of a forgotten past. And as always, the visuals are here to add context, but they are not necessary to follow along. You can simply listen and let the mystery unfold in your mind. Imagine a sky on a distant planet, a sky that is losing its ability to hold heat and life. This is the premise of the Gilded Shield theory. The idea that the Anunnaki needed to create a canopy of suspended gold particles in their atmosphere to reflect heat back to their planet and filter out lethal radiation. It sounds like science fiction, yet modern scientists have discussed similar geoengineering concepts to combat climate change on Earth today. If we accept this premise, the entire history of the Anunnaki on Earth becomes a massive industrial operation. Everything else, the cities, the kingship, the temples, and even the creation of humanity, was merely a byproduct of this one desperate need. You stand at the edge of the Abzu, the name given to the deep mining regions in southern Africa. According to the tablets, this was where the labor began. But here we encounter the first major friction point in the story. Mining is brutal. It is exhausting. Even for beings who descended from the heavens, the physical toll of extracting gold from the earth was too much. The texts tell us of the Ijiji, a subordinate class of deities who were tasked with the actual labor. For 40 periods, the length of which is debated, they toiled. They dug the shafts. They cleared the rubble. They hauled the ore. And then they broke. The tablets describe a rebellion, a strike of divine proportions. The Ijiji burned their tools and surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, demanding relief. This was the moment that changed everything. This was the moment humanity was conceived, not as a crowning achievement of divine love, but as a biological solution to a labor crisis. Enki, the master scientist, proposed the creation of a Lulu, a mixed one, by combining the genetic essence of the Anunnaki with the primitive hominids already present on Earth. They created a worker who was intelligent enough to follow instructions, but subservient enough to accept the burden of the mines. We were the Gilded Shield's workforce. We were the tools used to save a world we would never see. But as the millennia passed, the nature of the mission shifted. If you look at the archaeological record, you see the development of more and more sophisticated ways of tracking and storing wealth. You see the rise of the temple economies. But you also see something strange. There is no evidence of massive millions of tons of gold being exported from the planet. If the Anunnaki were here for hundreds of thousands of years mining for a planetary shield, where are the scars on the Earth that would match such a scale? This is where the theory of success or failure divides. One school of thought suggests the mission was a total success. They reached their quota. They stabilized the atmosphere of Nibiru. They had extracted enough gold to sustain their shield for eons. In this version of the story, the departure was a planned withdrawal. They finished the job, handed the keys of the world over to their half-human royal bloodlines, and left. They no longer needed the mines, and they no longer needed to manage the noisy, unruly human population that had grown far beyond its original purpose. This would explain why the gods seemed to fade into myth. They simply clocked out. The project was over. The Gilded Shield was complete, and Earth was left as a decommissioned industrial site, inhabited by the descendants of the workers who were left behind. But there is a darker, more unsettling possibility. What if the mission failed? What if the gold was never enough? Or what if the cost of maintaining the operation on Earth became greater than the benefit provided? There's a profound tension in the later Mesopotamian texts. The gods seem increasingly frustrated with humanity. The Enlil faction, in particular, views the human population as a mistake, a nuisance that prevents the gods from sleeping. The flood myths describe a deliberate attempt to wipe the slate clean. If the gold mining was still the primary goal, why would you destroy your entire workforce? Unless, of course, the gold was no longer priority. Perhaps the atmosphere of Nibiru could not be saved. Perhaps the suspended gold shield was a temporary fix that eventually succumbed to the laws of entropy. Or perhaps the internal politics of the Anunnaki, the wars between Enki and Enlil, between Marduk and the other factions, made the continuation of the Earth mission impossible. When we ask what happened to the Anunnaki after they left, we must consider that they might have left in defeat. Imagine the departure not as a grand ceremony of completion, but as a retreat. They left behind the ziggurats, the golden statues, and the cities they built, but they also left behind a species that was now hardwired to serve a purpose that no longer existed. This would explain the strange void that haunts ancient history. We see civilizations like the Sumerians appear with fully formed mathematics, law, and astronomy, only to slowly decline. It is as if they were running on the momentum of a lost technology, a lost guidance. We are like children left in a factory after the foremen have disappeared, still trying to operate the machines but forgetting what they were meant to produce. Consider the role of gold in our modern world. We still mine it with a feverish intensity. We store it in deep vaults under mountains and city streets. We use it in our most advanced electronics, in our spacecraft, and in our medical technology. It remains the ultimate hedge against uncertainty. If the Anunnaki left because they failed, perhaps we are still subconsciously trying to finish the job for them. Perhaps our drive to accumulate gold is a lingering command, a piece of ancient software still running in the human brain. We call it wealth, but to them, it was a biological necessity. Success or failure depends on how you interpret the state of the world they left behind. If they succeeded, then we are the lucky survivors of a cosmic construction project, given the gift of civilization as a parting gesture. If they failed, then we are an abandoned species, clinging to the yellow metal as if it could somehow bring our creators back. There is a silence in the deep minds of the world that mirrors the silence of the tablets. In the gold fields of South Africa, miners have discovered ancient shafts that date back tens of thousands of years. Mainstream archaeology often dismisses these as the work of localized tribes, but the scale and depth are often staggering. Could these be the physical remains of the Abzu? If so, the sheer amount of time represented in those tunnels suggests an operation of incredible longevity. But the lack of finished gold products in the graves of the era points to a massive removal of the material. It went somewhere. It did not stay in the hands of the humans who mined it. This supports the idea that the gold was being moved off-world. But the moment that flow stopped, the moment the shipments to the heavens ceased, the reason for the Anunnaki presence on Earth vanished. Whether it was a success or a failure, the result for humanity was the same. We were left with an insatiable hunger for a substance we do not truly need for survival. We were left with a hierarchy of kingship and priesthood designed to manage a labor force that no longer had a master. The gilded shield, whether it currently orbits a distant planet or fell apart long ago, remains the primary motivation for our existence according to these ancient accounts. It forces us to confront a question that reaches into the very heart of our identity. Are we the masters of our own destiny, or are we the remnants of a biological industrial complex? As we look at the ruins of Uruk and the crumbling walls of Babylon, we are looking at the offices of a defunct corporation. The gods did not just leave Earth. They closed the business. And we are the employees who never received a final paycheck, still showing up to work every day, still mining the gold, still looking at the stars and wondering when the next ship begins. This transition from an active mining operation to a silent, abandoned world is where the true mystery of the Anunnaki departure lies. It was not a single event, but a slow realization. The priests kept performing the rituals, hoping for a response. The kings kept claiming divine authority, hoping for a sign. But the sky remained empty. The gold remained in the ground or locked in vaults. The Gilded Shield, the great project that defined the first chapters of human history, had either served its purpose or been abandoned to the void. To understand what happened next, we have to look at what we did with that silence. We have to look at how we transformed that industrial purpose into the religions and myths that still shape our world today. The story of the gold is the story of our beginning, but the story of the shield is the story of our abandonment. As we move forward, we must ask if the Anunnaki will ever return for the gold we have spent the last few thousand years accumulating. Is the mission truly over? Or is the Earth simply a warehouse, waiting for the return of its owners? The answer may be hidden in the very way our civilizations are structured, in the golden domes of our temples and the golden bars of our banks. We are still a species defined by the Gilded Shield, forever looking up, waiting for the gods who taught us how to dig. Thank you for always having our back as we explore these unsettling truths. Prepare yourself, for we are about to descend into the next layer of the mystery. The shift is coming, and the truth of the gold is only the beginning. To understand why the temples went cold and the gods vanished into the stars, we must first look at the fractures within the divine house itself. The Anunnaki were never a monolith. They were a family, and like all royal families, their history is written in the blood of sibling rivalry and the bitter dust of civil war. We often imagine the departure of the gods as a clean exit, a unified decision to leave humanity behind. But the clay tablets tell a different story. A story of a throne room divided against itself, where the very beings who shaped our world began to tear it apart in their struggle for supremacy. This is the era of the throne room wars, where celestial order collapsed into earthly chaos. It is a period that forces us to ask if the Anunnaki did not so much leave Earth as they were driven out by their own internal collapses. The core of this conflict lies in the fundamental tension between two brothers. Enlil and Enki, these were the two pillars of the Anunnaki leadership, but they represented two completely different visions for the future of Earth and the future of humanity. Enlil was the Lord of the Command, the chief executive of the gods. He viewed the earth as a divine estate and humanity as a necessary, but increasingly irritating workforce. To Enlil, the rules were absolute. The hierarchy was sacred, and any deviation from that order was a threat to the cosmic balance. Enki, on the other hand, was the lord of wisdom and the master of the deep waters. He was the scientist, the creator, the one who had personally mixed the clay and the divine blood to bring us into existence. Enki felt a paternal connection to his creation that Enlil could never understand. Where Enlil saw a noisy population that needed to be managed or removed, Enki saw a project that needed to be protected. This was not merely a philosophical disagreement. It was a cold war that played out over millennia. Every major catastrophe in the Sumerian record, from the Great Flood to the destruction of entire cities, can be traced back to this central rift in the Divine Council. The Atrahasis epic gives us a chilling window into these throne room debates. We hear the voice of Enlil complaining that the clamor of humanity has become unbearable, that he can no longer sleep, because of the noise of human civilization. He demands a total solution, a final purge, and when he finally forces a council to agree to the flood, it is not an act of divine justice. It is an act of divine frustration. Enki, however, refuses to let his creation vanish. He breaks his oath of silence to warn the hero of the flood, speaking to the wall of a reed hut, so that the human on the other side might hear and survive. Think about the implications of this. The two most powerful beings on the planet were working at cross purposes, one trying to erase humanity and the other trying to save us. This was the first great fracture in the house of the gods, and it set the stage for everything that followed. After the flood, the relationship between the gods and their human servants changed forever. The distance grew, the trust was gone, and the Council of the Anunnaki began to look less like a governing body and more like a battlefield. As the centuries passed, the conflict intensified as a new generation of gods rose to power. Foremost among them was Marduk, the son of Enki. Marduk was ambitious, brilliant, and deeply resentful of the traditional power structures that kept his father in a secondary position. While Enlil and his descendants held the keys to the supreme authority, Marduk began to build his own power base in the city of Babylon. He did not just want to be a god among many. He wanted to be the king of all gods. He wanted to consolidate the 50 names of power and rewrite the very history of the universe to place himself at its center. This was the beginning of the Second Throne Room War, a conflict that would eventually tear the Mesopotamian world apart. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, is effectively a piece of political propaganda designed to justify Marduk's rise. It describes a cosmos in chaos where the older gods are paralyzed by fear until young Marduk steps forward to defeat the dragon of chaos. In exchange for his victory, he demands absolute sovereignty. The older Anunnaki are forced to bow. They are relegated to the background. Their temples are maintained, but their direct influence is curbed. But Marduk's rise was not peaceful. The tablet suggests that this transition was marked by actual physical conflict. Some researchers look at the ruins of cities like Harappa or the strange vitrified stones in the desert and wonder if these throne room wars involve technologies that we are only now beginning to understand. The Sumerian lamentations speak an evil wind that swept across the land, a wind that did not come from the sea or the desert, but was born of the gods' anger. This wind killed the people. It turned the water bitter. It made the soil barren for generations. The lament for Uar describes the gods literally fleeing their cities as this destructive force approached. They abandoned their shrines. They left their statues in the dust. They were not leaving out a choice. They were fleeing a disaster that they themselves had unleashed. This is a critical point that is often overlooked in the ancient astronaut narrative. The departure was not necessarily a dignified flight into the sunset. It was a retreat from a radioactive, or at least a spiritually and physically poisoned landscape. The wars between the factions of the Anunnaki had made the Earth a place of trauma and ruin. If they were indeed extraterrestrial visitors, their mission had failed. Their workforce was in rebellion or dying. Their home bases were being destroyed by their own weaponry, and their internal unity was shattered beyond repair. And then there's the role of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Inanna represents a third force in these conflicts. She was neither a traditionalist like Enlil nor a master scientist like Enki. She was a disruptor. She traveled to the underworld to confront death itself. She tricked Enki into giving her to me the sacred decrees of civilization, which she then transported to her own city of Uruk. She was the one who most frequently crossed the line between the divine and the mortal, choosing kings and leading armies into battle. Her ambition was as great as Marduk's, and her presence added a layer of volatility to an already explosive situation. When you look at the archaeological record, you see a strange pattern emerge. The early cities were built with a terrifying precision and scale. But as the throne room wars progressed, that precision began to fade. The temples became smaller. The knowledge of the me began to be lost or corrupted. It is as if the teachers were preoccupied with their own survival and had no more time for their pupils. The gods who once walked through the streets of Eridu and Uruk were now retreated behind the walls of their ziggurats, and eventually they were gone altogether. There is a finality in the later texts that is deeply unsettling. The gods are described as being distant. They no longer speak directly to the kings. They speak through omens, through the movements of the planets, through the entrails of sacrificial animals. The direct line of communication was severed. The throne room was empty. The wars had ended not with a victory, but with a weary withdrawal. Some suggest that the Anunnaki realized that their presence on Earth was no longer sustainable, that the human population they had created had become too powerful and too numerous to control, especially while the gods themselves were so divided. Others believe that the departure was a tactical retreat, that the factions of Enlil and Enki, along with the followers of Marduk and Inanna, simply moved their conflict off-planet, that they left behind a shattered civilization and a confused species to pick up the pieces of story they only half understood. When we look at the ruins of the ancient world, we are looking at the wreckage of a house divided. We are looking at the aftermath of a war that began in heaven and ended in the desert sands of Iraq. It forces us to confront a haunting possibility. What if we were not the primary focus of the gods at all? What if we were merely the bystanders in a cosmic drama that was always about them? Their wars, their egos, their struggle for the throne. When they left, they did not leave because they were finished with us. They left because they were finished with each other. They left us with their stories, their laws, their calendars. But they also left us with the trauma of their departure, a sense of abandonment that has haunted human religion for thousands of years. The silence that haunts the tablets is the silence of a house where the parents have fought and left, and the children are left to wonder if they will ever return. Tell me in the comments if you think the gods left because they had to or because they wanted to. Do you see the echoes of these throne room wars in our own world today? Prepare yourselves for what comes next as we look at the actual mechanics of how they might have left and where they might have gone. The answer is etched in the stars and hidden in the deep memory of our species. Prepare yourself as we continue this journey into the mystery of the Anunnaki. Thank you for having our back as we uncover these ancient truths. Let us move forward into the darkness to find the light. We have spent much of our journey looking toward the stars, tracking the theoretical flight paths of beings who supposedly return to a distant home. We have analyzed the silence of the tablets and the slow decay of the ziggurats as evidence of a grand withdrawal. But tonight, we must turn our gaze back to the dust. We must ask a question that is perhaps more unsettling than the idea of gods leaving. What if they did not all go? What if the departure was not a clean break, but a selective evacuation that left a remnant behind? In the deep layers of Mesopotamian myth and the hidden corners of the archaeological record, there are whispers of the ones who were left to watch the gates, the deserted sentinels, the forgotten ones who remained on Earth while their masters ascended into the celestial blackness. To understand what happened to the Anunnaki, we must look at those who were never meant to leave. In the earliest Sumerian accounts, the divine hierarchy was divided into two distinct classes. There were the Anunnaki, the princely offspring of the sky god Anu, who functioned as the supreme lords and decision makers. And then there were the Igigi. These were the lesser gods, the laborers of heaven, the ones who were assigned the backbreaking work of maintaining the world. For thousands of years, according to the Atrahasis epic, the Igigi were the ones who dug the irrigation canals, cleared the channels, and maintained the cosmic infrastructure that kept the world functioning. They were the original workers, the divine proletariat whose exhaustion eventually led to a rebellion that forced the creation of humanity. But while humanity took over the physical labor of the fields and the mines, the Igigi did not simply vanish. They remained as a separate, lower-tier divinity. And it is here, in this class of beings, that we find the most impelling candidates for the Sentinels left behind. Think about the logistical reality of a planetary departure. If we are to entertain the ancient astronaut hypothesis for a moment, if a highly advanced civilization were to withdraw from a colony after thousands of years of occupation, they would not simply walk away and leave the lights on. They would leave a skeleton crew. They would leave technicians to maintain the power sources, guardians to protect the sacred sites, and observers to monitor the fledgling human civilization they left in their wake. In the Sumerian texts, these roles are fulfilled by a group of beings often described as the Apkallu, or the Seven Sages. These were not quite gods, but certainly not humans. They were described as fish-like beings who emerged from the freshwater ocean of the Abzu to teach humanity the arts of civilization. While the great Anunnaki gods held court in their ziggurats or retreated to the heavens, the Apkallu were the ones who stayed in the trenches, guiding the development of writing, law, and architecture. They were the intermediaries, the ones who remained. But as the centuries turned into millennia, the status of these remainders began to shift. In the earliest records, they are honored as benefactors. But in the later Babylonian and Assyrian periods, the tone of the inscriptions changes. The sages become more mysterious, more distant, and eventually more dangerous. They are no longer seen as teachers, but as powerful and potentially malevolent spirits who must be warded off with protective amulets and rituals. This is the first clue to the fate of the deserted Sentinels. As their connection to the departed masters grew thin, as the technology they guarded began to fail, as the memory of their original purpose faded, these beings were reimagined by humanity. They transformed from divine administrators into the monsters of folklore. Consider the ruins of Baalbek in modern Lebanon. Here, we find some of the most massive stones ever moved by human or divine hands. The trilithon consists of 3 blocks weighing over 800 tons each, set into a foundation that predates the Roman temple of Jupiter built above it. Traditional archaeology struggles to explain how these stones were quarried, transported, and precisely placed using Bronze Age technology. Ancient astronaut theorists suggest this was a launch platform or celestial landing site. But if it was a site of departure, what happened to the ones tasked with its protection? Local legends speak of giants who inhabited these ruins long after the gods had gone. They speak of beings who possessed remnants of ancient knowledge, but who had grown wild and strange in their isolation. These are the deserted Sentinels, the ones who stayed to guard the machines long after the machines had stopped working. This theme of the abandoned guardian is not limited to Mesopotamia. We find it reflected in the Jewish tradition of the Watchers, as described in the Book of Enoch. The Watchers were a group of angels assigned to observe humanity, but they supposedly fell from grace by intermarrying with human women and teaching forbidden knowledge. If we strip away the religious language, we are left with the story of a group of observers who were left on Earth, who became disconnected from their central authority, and who eventually integrated into the local population or became outcasts. The Book of Enoch describes these beings as being imprisoned in the valleys of the earth, awaiting a final judgment. It is a haunting image. Divine beings trapped on a planet that was once their workshop, now their prison, watching as the humans they once managed grow into the masters of the world. What would happen to an immortal being left on Earth for thousands of years without the support of its own kind? The psychological toll is a theme that haunts the edges of our oldest stories. We see it in the character of Enkidu in the Gilgamesh epic. He is a being who is neither god nor man, who lives among the animals until he is civilized by humanity. We see it in the various legends of the Hidden Ones, the dwellers in caves, the guardians of the mountains. These beings are often described as possessing great wisdom, but also great sorrow. They are the survivors of a world that no longer exists. They are the ones who remember the time when the gods walked the earth, and who must now live in the silence that followed. As the great urban centers of Mesopotamia began to collapse, the sentinels would have retreated to the fringes. They would have moved into the deep deserts, the high mountains, and the subterranean chambers of the temples. In these isolated places, they would have become the basis for the jinns of Arabian folklore or the ghouls of the waste. These are not just inventions of the imagination. They are the cultural shadows cast by something that was once real. When a society encounters something it can no longer explain, it turns it into a monster. The technician in a silver suit becomes a gleaming spirit. The guardian of a subterranean vault becomes a demon of the underworld. The deserted sentinels did not die out. They were simply rebranded by the fear of the humans who stumbled upon their hiding places. The archaeological record provides some strange hints that support this idea of a lingering, hidden presence. In many ancient sites, we find evidence of continuous occupation or ritual activity long after the official history says the site was abandoned. We find strange modifications to ancient structures, as if someone were trying to keep them operational with increasingly primitive tools. We find caches of sacred objects hidden away in tunnels, guarded by traps that seem far too sophisticated for their time. These are the footprints of the ones who stayed, the ones who were tasked with keeping the fire burning until a return that never came. But why would they be left behind? Perhaps it was not a mistake. Perhaps the Anunnaki left the Sentinels as a fail-safe. If humanity ever reached a certain level of development, or the Earth faced a cosmic threat, these guardians would be there to reactivate the ancient systems. This brings us to one of the most provocative theories in the study of ancient mysteries. The idea that the Anunnaki did not just leave behind beings, but they left behind an automated system of sentinels, artificial intelligences or biological constructs designed to monitor the planet and report back to the home world. This would explain why the descriptions of these beings are often so strange, combining human, animal, and mechanical attributes. They were not living gods, but tools, sentient machines that outlasted their creators and became the ghosts in the ruins. Consider the Egyptian concept of the Shem-Sahor, the followers of Horus. These were a semi-divine race of beings who supposedly ruled Egypt for thousands of years before the first human pharaohs. They were the ones who preserved the sacred knowledge from the time of the gods, the Zep-Tepi, or the first time. The Shem-Su-Hor were the sentinels of the Nile. They were the ones who ensured that the divine order was maintained during the long transition between the departure of the gods and the rise of human civilization. Like the Apkallu of Sumer, they eventually faded into myth, but their influence is stamped into every temple and every pyramid. They were the bridge, the forgotten ones who held the world together while the masters were away. As we look at the desolate ruins of the ancient world today, it is easy to see only stone and sand. But if we listen to the stories, if we read between the lines of the tablets, we begin to sense a different presence, a feeling of being watched, not by gods in heaven, but by something much closer to home, something that is still here, perhaps buried deep beneath the ice of Antarctica or hidden in the vastness of the Amazon. The deserted sentinels are the ultimate mystery of the Anunnaki saga. They are the evidence that the story did not end when the crafts ascended. They are the proof that we were never truly alone, even in the long silence of the last 2,000 years. The fate of these sentinels is ultimately a tragic one. To be immortal and forgotten is a punishment worse than death. They watched as their temples were looted. They watched as the languages they taught were replaced by others. They watched as the humans they once created for labor began to build their own empires, their own gods, and their own weapons. They are the silent witnesses to the entire history of our species. And perhaps they're still waiting for a signal, waiting for a return, or simply waiting for the end of their long, lonely vigil. As we move forward into our next investigation, we must carry this thought with us. The ruins are not empty. They are manned by the ghosts of a civilization that was once the master of this world. The deserted sentinels are still at their posts, hidden in the shadows of history, forgotten by their makers, but perhaps, finally, ready to be remembered by us. The light is beginning to touch the deepest parts of the desert, and what it reveals will change everything we thought we knew about the end of the Age of Gods. Let us see what remains in the light of the rising sun. There is a frequency that persists long after the source has vanished, a lingering vibration in the air that suggests a presence where the eyes see only emptiness. In the study of ancient civilizations, we call this the ghost signal. It is the moment when a living, breathing culture transforms into a collection of echoes. For thousands of years, the Anunnaki were the central frequency of the Mesopotamian world. Their names were shouted in the streets, whispered in the inner sanctums of temples, and carved into the very foundations of the earth. But then, the signal began to change. It grew faint, distorted by time and the rise of new voices. To understand what happened to the Anunnaki after they supposedly left Earth, we must learn to decipher these celestial whispers. We must look not at the monuments they built while they were here, but at the strange, frantic attempts of humanity to keep the connection alive after the line went dead. You're standing in the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. It is the middle of the 7th century before the Common Era. Around you are tens of thousands of clay tablets, the accumulated knowledge of a world that is already ancient. But there is a tension in this room. The scribes here are not just recording history. They are obsessed with observation. They are tracking the movements of the planets with a precision that seems almost desperate. This is the era of the Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive series of tablets that serve as a manual for interpreting the sky. But why the obsession? Why did the later Babylonians and Assyrians spend centuries documenting every flicker of a star and every eclipse of the moon? The answer lies in the silence of the temples. The gods who once walked among men, the Anunnaki who issued direct commands to kings, were no longer speaking in person. The physical presence had been replaced by a distant, coded signal. Mainstream history tells us that this shift represents the birth of astronomy. But from the perspective of those who believed in the Anunnaki, it was something far more poignant. It was a search for a lost signal. If the gods were no longer in their houses on earth, they must be in the heavens. The stars were not just balls of gas and fire to the ancients. They were the Lamashi, the celestial writing of the gods. When a king looked at the night sky, he was not looking at the universe. He was reading a letter from a departed father. This is the first great ghost signal. The Anunnaki had withdrawn from the terrestrial plane, but they had left their footprints in the mechanics of the solar system. The transition from myth to math was not a sign of progress, but a sign of abandonment. We became astronomers because we were lonely. Consider the strange phenomenon of the lamentation texts. These are among the most heart-wrenching documents in human history. In cities like Ur and Nippur, we find tablets that describe the departure of the gods as a literal, physical catastrophe. The text known as a lamentation over the destruction of Sumer, and Ur describes the goddess Nana and the god Enlil literally turning their backs on their cities. It describes a divine presence leaving the temple like a bird taking flight. This is not the language of metaphorical religious change. This is the language of a survivor describing a plane taking off from a runway. The people felt the vacuum. They felt the sudden drop in the spiritual pressure of their world. When the Anunnaki left, they did not leave a forwarding address. They left a void that the priests tried to fill with increasingly complex rituals and mathematical models. But there is a second signal, one that is even more mysterious. It is the signal of the names. In the later periods of Mesopotamian history, we see the names of the Anunnaki begin to morph and bleed into one another. This is what scholars call syncretism, but it looks more like a signal being compressed. Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, began to absorb the attributes of all the other gods. One tablet lists the different gods as being merely different aspects of Marduk. Enlil is Marduk of lordship. Sin is Marduk, the illuminator of the night. This represents a narrowing of the frequency. As the distinct personalities of the Anunnaki faded from the collective memory, they were merged into a single distant authority. The Council of the Gods, one of vibrant and argumentative assembly of powerful individuals, became a monochromatic unity. The signal was becoming a hum. Where did they go? If we follow the whispers in the text, we find a recurring theme of the distant horizon. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero travels to the mouth of the rivers to find Utnapishtim, the man who was granted immortality by the Anunnaki. This place is described as being at the very edge of the world, a place where the sun rises and sets through massive gates guarded by scorpion men. It is a threshold. The later Mesopotamians believed their gods had retreated to these liminal spaces. They were still on Earth, perhaps, but they were in the places where the dimensions touched. They were in the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth. They were in the high places of the mountains where the clouds met the sky. They were in the gaps between things. This idea of the gods inhabiting the gaps is reflected in the archaeological record of the late periods. We see a shift in temple architecture. The inner sanctums become smaller, more guarded, and more remote. The massive public ceremonies of the early Sumerian period gave way to secret rituals performed in the dark. The gods were no longer the public governors of the city. They had become the hidden masters of the occult. This is a third signal, the signal of secrecy. When the Anunnaki stopped being kings, they became ghosts. They became the subject of esoteric knowledge, passed down through lineages of priests who claimed to still possess the ancient keys to the divine frequency. Perhaps the most haunting ghost signal of all comes from the city of Haran. Located in what is now Turkey, Haran remained a center of worship for the moon god Sin, a member of the Anunnaki Council, long after the rest of the world had moved on to Christianity and Islam. The people of Haran, known as the Sabians, claimed to be the inheritors of the original religion of the stars. They were the last ones listening to the celestial whispers. Even as late as the 10th century of the Common Era, long after the last cuneiform tablet had been carved, the Sabians were still performing rituals to the planetary deities. They were the final guardians of the frequency. When Islamic scholars visited Haran, they were shocked to find a community that still spoke the language of the ancient gods. But even there, the signal was dying. The Sabians eventually vanished, their knowledge absorbed into the rising tide of Islamic alchemy and Western magic. What was the content of these final whispers? When we look at the late Babylonian astronomical diaries, We see a world that is obsessed with timing. They were not just watching the stars. They were waiting for a return. Every calculation of the position of Jupiter, every observation of the rising of Venus, was infused with the hope of a reconnection. They were like the operators of a long-range radio telescope, scanning the cosmic noise for a pattern that proved they were not alone. This is the heart of the ancient astronaut theory, though translated into the language of the soul. The belief that the gods would one day return to reclaim their temples is the ultimate ghost signal. It is a hope that has never truly died. You see it today in our own obsession with the stars. When we launch probes to Mars or send signals into the deep space between the stars, are we not doing exactly what the priests of Nineveh were doing? We are looking for a sign. We are looking for a presence. The Anunnaki may have left the clay of Mesopotamia, but they never left the human imagination. They migrated from the earth to the sky, and from the sky into the digital signals of our own technological age. The ghost signals are still there. They are in the myths of Nibiru that haunt the corners of the internet. They are in the strange anomalies we find in ancient maps. They are in the persistent feeling that our history is not what we have been told. But here is the most unsettling thought of all. What if the signal did not just get weaker? What if it was intentionally silenced? Some texts suggest a period of conflict among the gods, a moment when the council decided that humanity had become too noisy, too chaotic. The flood was the first attempt to quiet the signal. Perhaps the departure was the final one. By withdrawing their presence and their technology, the Anunnaki ensured that humanity would be left in a state of spiritual and technological amnesia. We were left to wander the ruins of their cities, trying to piece together the blueprint of our own origin from broken shards of clay. We are a species with a ghost signal at the core of our identity. As we descend further into the mystery, we must ask ourselves what it means to live in the wake of such a departure. Are we the abandoned children of a celestial race? Or are we the final stage of an experiment that no longer requires a supervisor? The whispers in the stars give no easy answer. They only offer the rhythm of the spheres, the cold, mathematical precision of a universe that continues to turn long after the architect have moved on. But the fact that we are still listening, the fact that we are still looking for the pattern, says something profound about who we are. We are the ones who remember the light. We are the ones who refuse to believe in the silence. The ruins of Babylon are quiet now. The wind whistles through the reconstructed Ishtar Gate, and the dust settles on the mounds where the great ziggurats once stood. But if you stand there long enough, if you quiet your own mind and listen to the landscape, you can almost hear it, a faint rhythmic pulse, a signal from a source that is gone, yet remains. The Anunnaki left Earth, but they left us with the ability to look up. They left us with the hunger for the stars. And as long as we continue to scan the heavens, as long as we continue to decipher the celestial whispers, the signal remains active. We are the ghost signal. We are the evidence of their stay. The story of the Anunnaki is not a story of an ending. It is a story of a transition. It is a story of how a species moves from the direct guidance of the gods to the lonely responsibility of its own destiny. The celestial whispers are not just memories of the past. They are the coordinates for our future. In the next segment, we will follow these coordinates to the final, most shocking revelation of all. We will look at the physical evidence that remains, the fingerprints of a presence that could not be completely erased by time. We will see how the ghost signals are being decoded by modern science, and what they tell us about the ultimate fate of the beings who from heaven to earth came. The whispers are getting louder. It is time to listen. There is a clock buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, not made of gears and springs, but of numbers and celestial alignments. It is a clock that measures not hours or days, but millennia. If we are to believe the radical interpretations of the ancient tablets, the Anunnaki did not merely leave Earth in a fit of pique or a random exodus. They left according to a schedule, a grand, cosmic itinerary dictated by the very mechanics of the heavens. To understand what happened to them after they departed, we must understand the timing of their leaving and, more importantly, the timing of their promised return. In the Sumerian king list, we encounter a unit of time that is as baffling as it is precise. The Shar. One Shar is equivalent to 3,600 years. This number is not arbitrary. It is the foundation of the sexagesimal system, the base 60 math that still governs how we measure our minutes in our circles today. But in the context of the Anunnaki, the Shar takes on a darker, more significant meaning. According to the theories that challenge our traditional history, 3,600 years is the length of one single orbit of the planet Nibiru around our sun. This is a celestial clock upon which the entire history of the Anunnaki on Earth is supposedly built. If they came during one orbital window, it stands to reason they would leave during another. And it is in this calculation of the great cycle that we find the heart of the mystery of their return. You must imagine the priests of Babylon standing upon the highest terraces of the ziggurats, their eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the stars. They were not merely astronomers. They were timekeepers of the gods. They understood that the universe moved in cycles within cycles, wheels within wheels. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the earth that shifts the backdrop of the stars over thousands of years. They knew that we were moving to the great year, a cycle of 26,000 years that saw the rise and fall of entire civilizations. To the ancient mind, the departure of the Anunnaki was not a permanent goodbye, but a phase in a recurring pattern. The gods withdrew when the celestial alignment signaled the end of their era, but they left behind the mathematics of their reappearance. This is the promised return that haunts the esoteric traditions of the world. It is a belief that the gods keep the time of stars, not the time of men, and that their departure was simply the beginning of a long countdown. But when does the clock hit zero? This is the question that has fueled 1,000 years of prophecy and 100 years of speculation. If we look at the historical record, the visible presence of the gods began to fade around the time of the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era. By the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the gods were already distant memories, residing in the heavens rather than the temples. If we apply the logic of the 3,600-year orbit, we are forced to confront an unsettling possibility. If the Anunnaki departed during a celestial window thousands of years ago, the cycle suggests that the window for their return is not in some distant, unrecognizable future. It is near. Some theorists, calculating from the collapse of Sumer and the final departures from the city of Haran, suggest that the return of the celestial body associated with the Anunnaki could be occurring within our own epoch. They point to the shift from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius as the cosmic alarm clock. This transition of the ages is not just a concept for astrologers. In the ancient world, the shift from one zodiacal sign to another marked a change in divine administration. When the spring equinox moved from the sign of the bull, Taurus, to the sign of the ram, Aries, it signaled a shift in power from Enlil to Marduk. When it moved from Aries to Pisces, the gods seemed to withdraw further into the shadows. Now, as we stand on the precipice of the age of Aquarius, many ask if this is the moment the great cycle completes itself. Is the promised return a literal physical event, or is it a psychological awakening? To the Sumerians, there was no difference. The movements of the heavens were the movements of the divine. If the stars said it was time for the kingship to descend once more from heaven, then the world would have to prepare. To understand the weight of this promised return, You have to understand the Mesopotamian concept of the tablets of destiny. These were not mere pieces of clay, but the ultimate authority over the cosmic order. Whoever held the tablets of destiny controlled the timing of events, the fates of nations, and the movements of the gods themselves. In the myths, the struggle for these tablets is the central conflict of the universe. When the Anunnaki left, they took the tablets of destiny with them, leaving humanity to navigate the dark waters of history without a map. The promise of the return is, at its core, the promise that the map will one day be returned to us, that the order of the world will be restored by the same beings who first established it in the deep time of our origins. But here, we must pause and consider the nature of this return. Many modern interpretations have sought to find physical evidence of this approaching cycle. They look for a hidden tent planet, a massive celestial body on a long elliptical orbit that periodically disturbs the inner solar system. They search the heavens for an infrared signature that matches the descriptions of the winged disk. But perhaps the timing is not about a physical planet. Perhaps the 3,600-year Shar is a measurement of the life cycle of human consciousness. Consider the fact that every 3,600 years, human civilization undergoes a radical, fundamental transformation. We see it in the birth of writing, in cities around 3,500 before the Common Era. We see it in the Axial Age, where the old religions were swept away by new philosophies. We are now approaching another such threshold. Is it possible that the Anunnaki left behind a programmed evolution? That the timing of their return is not about their physical arrival, but about our reaching a certain level of technological and spiritual maturity? In this view, the Great Cycle is a developmental timer. The gods withdrew to allow the human experiment to run its course, to see if the hybrid species they created could survive its own noise and violence. The promised return then becomes a graduation ceremony, or a final judgment. It is the moment when the creators return to see what their creation has become. This is why the timing is so fraught with anxiety. In every culture that remembers the Anunnaki under different names, the return of the gods is associated with the end of days. It is a time of great shaking, of the revealing of secrets, and the weighing of hearts. The Sumerian tablets speak of the day of the Lord, a time when the heavens would darken, and the earth would tremble as the great celestial bark of the gods appeared. This imagery was later absorbed into the apocalyptic visions of the prophets, but its roots are in the astronomical observations of the Sumerian priests. They weren't describing the end of the world in a literal, destructive sense, but the end of a cycle, the closing of one Shar, and the beginning of another. For the ancient Mesopotamian, time was not a straight line heading toward a distant horizon. It was a circle. Everything that had happened would happen again. The gods who had walked in the streets of Uruk would walk there again. The wisdom that had been lost would be found. The kingship that had been withdrawn would be lowered once more. You can see the remnants of this belief in the very architecture of our modern world. Why are we so obsessed with the year 2000 or 2012, or the midpoint of the 21st century? Why do our movies and our stories keep returning to the theme of an ancient, superior intelligence returning to reclaim the earth? It is because the great cycle is etched into our collective memory. We are like children left in a house with a clock that we do not fully understand, watching the hands move closer to the hour when we were told our parents would return. This sense of waiting, of living in the interval between the departure and the reappearance, defines the human condition. We are the species of the middle time. The mathematics of the return are preserved in the most unlikely places. We find them in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid, in the verses of the Vedas, and in the secret geometries of cathedral builders. They all point back to the same sexagesimal ratios, the same 3,600-year rhythm. It is as if the Anunnaki left a trail of breadcrumbs made of numbers, knowing that only a civilization that had mastered those same numbers would be able to recognize the timing of their return. To solve the math of the Shar is to unlock the schedule of the cosmos. But even as we calculate the dates, we are left with the silence. The tablets tell us how they measured time, and they tell us that the gods will return when the cycle completes. But they do not tell us what that return will look like for a humanity that has forgotten the faces of its fathers. As we move deeper into this exploration, we have to ask if the return has already begun, not with a fleet of ships in the sky, but with the rediscovery of the tablets themselves. For thousands of years, the stories of the Anunnaki were buried under the dust of a rock, forgotten by the world. Their names were lost, their ziggurats were mounds of mud, and their mathematics were a mystery. Then, in the 19th century, we began to dig. We found the libraries of Ashurbanipal. We learned to read the cuneiform script. We rediscovered the Shar. Is the return of the knowledge the first phase of the return of the beings? If the Anunnaki are indeed the guardians of our genetic and cultural blueprint, then our sudden rediscovery of our own origins might be the signal that the great cycle is entering its final quadrant. We stand in the ruins of the old world, looking at a sky that is no longer empty, but filled with our own satellites and probes. We have become the beings who can look back at the earth and the heavens, just as the Anunnaki once did. We have mastered the atom. We are editing the genome, and we are reaching for the stars. Perhaps the timing of the promised return is based on this very mirror. We are becoming the gods we once worshipped. And as the 3,600-year clock ticks toward its conclusion, we find ourselves in a race against time. A race to understand the message left in the clay before the authors of that message reappear to read what we have written in the margins of their work. The great cycle is moving. The stars are shifting. The age of the fish is giving way to the age of the water-bearer. In the ancient texts, the god Enki was often associated with the water skin, the bringer of civilization and wisdom. As we enter the age that bears a symbol, the question of the promised return takes on a new urgency. Was the departure of the Anunnaki merely a long sleep in the cradle of the cosmos? And are we now hearing the first sounds of their awakening? The answer is hidden in the math, preserved in the myth, and waiting for us in the stars. Prepare yourself, for the clock is moving, and the hour of the great cycle is closer than you think. Tell me in the comments if you believe these cycles are literal or if they are metaphors for our own internal growth. How do you measure the time of the soul against the time of the stars? We are descending now into the final mysteries of the Exodus, and the path ahead is lit by the fire of ancient revelations. Let us continue. If the gods truly left, if they boarded their celestial barks and ascended beyond the reach of the human eye, they did not leave us empty-handed. They left behind a residue, a lingering presence that vibrates in the marrow of our bones and the firing of our neurons. We are told in the Atrahasis epic that we are the Lulu, the mixed ones, a blending of the terrestrial and the divine. Clay of the earth fused with the flesh and blood of a sacrifice god named Wheela. This is more than just a colorful creation myth. It is a statement of identity. It suggests that at the very root of human existence, there is a fundamental duality. We are a species with our feet in the mud and our heads in the stars. Today, we must ask if this ancient story of biological synthesis is a distorted memory of a physical reality. If the Anunnaki departed, did they leave their signature written in the chemical code of our species? To explore this, we have to look beyond the ruins of stone and mud brick and look into the microscopic architecture of the human cell. The mainstream scientific narrative tells us that Homo sapiens emerged through the slow, grinding process of natural selection over millions of years. It is a story of gradual adaptation, of trial and error, of survival in the harsh environments of the Pleistocene. But within this narrative, there are moments of sudden, almost inexplicable acceleration. The Neolithic Revolution, the sudden appearance of complex language, the rapid expansion of the human brain. These are leaps that continue to fascinate and frustrate evolutionary biologists. To the ancient astronaut theorists, these are not natural occurrences, but the result of targeted intervention. They argue that the Anunnaki did not just teach us how to plant grain or build walls. They altered the very blueprint of who we are. They suggest that the jump from our hominid ancestors to the modern human was a laboratory event, a moment where the flesh of a god was literally mixed with the clay of the earth to create a worker species capable of high-level intelligence but bound by the limitations of a mortal body. If we entertain this perspective, even as a thought experiment, the implications are staggering. It would mean that the Anunnaki never truly left Earth because they're encoded within us. Our DNA would be a palimpsest, an ancient document where the original divine writing has been partially erased and written over by thousands of years of evolution. Yet the original script still remains. Some proponents of this theory point to what scientists once called junk DNA, the vast sequences of our genome that do not seem to code for specific proteins. While modern genetics is beginning to understand the regulatory functions of these sequences, the fringe interpretation remains provocative. Could these silent regions of our genome be vestigial traces of a celestial heritage? Could they be the dormant instructions left behind by our creators, waiting for a trigger that has not yet arrived? But the legacy of the Anunnaki is not found only in the biological. It is found in the very structures of our civilization, the cultural DNA that we replicate every single day without even realizing its origin. Consider the way we measure our reality. When you look at your watch and see 60 minutes in an hour, when you look at a compass and see 360 degrees in a circle, when you divide a year into 12 months, you are participating in a system of mathematics and timekeeping that was perfected in the temples of Sumer. The sexagesimal system, based on the number 60, was not a random choice. It was a sophisticated tool developed to track the movements of the planets and the cycles of the stars, movements that the Sumerians believed were the activities of the Anunnaki themselves. We are still living within the temporal architecture built by those who came from heaven to earth. Every time we check the time, we are using the syntax of the gods to organize our lives. This legacy extends into the very way we organize our societies. The concept of kingship, the idea that certain individuals have a divine right to rule, is a direct inheritance from the Mesopotamian worldview. The Sumerian king list explicitly states that kingship was lowered from heaven. It was a gift from the Anunnaki, a means of maintaining the cosmic order on Earth. Even though we have moved toward democratic systems, the deep structure of hierarchy persists. Our obsession with authority, our need for leaders who possess a kind of numinous charisma, our tendency to build sprawling bureaucracies to manage our affairs, all of these are echoes of the organizational charts first implemented in the cities of Uruk and Uar. We have replaced the gods with politicians and CEOs, but the pattern of the divine household, the estate managed by specialized administrators for a higher power, remains a fundamental model for human organization. Even our relationship with technology seems to carry the ghost of the Anunnaki. There is a strange, persistent drive in our species to transcend our biological limits, to reach for the stars, to master the forces of nature through artifice. Some thinkers suggest that this is a manifestation of a dormant program, a lingering memory of our creators who were themselves masters of technology. We are the only species on this planet that seems fundamentally dissatisfied with its natural state. We build machines to fly, because we remember those who flew. We build computers to store vast amounts of data, because we were created by those who recorded the fates on tablets of lapis lazuli. Our drive toward transhumanism, toward the merging of biology and technology, could be seen as a subconscious attempt to return to our original divine state, to reclaim the flesh and blood of the gods that was mixed into our earthly clay. But perhaps the most profound legacy is the psychological one. There is a haunting sense of abandonment that permeates human history, a feeling that we were once close to something immense and powerful, and that we have been left behind to find our own way in a silent universe. This is the God-shaped hole that philosophers and theologians have discussed for centuries. If the ancient astronaut theory holds any kernel of truth, this feeling is not just a spiritual metaphor. It is a species-wide trauma, the memory of a departure. The silence that haunts the ruins of the ziggurats is the same silence that we feel when we look up at the night sky and wonder why no one is calling back. We are like children who have been raised by tutors who then vanished, leaving us with their books and their tools, but no instructions on how to truly live without them. This trauma manifests in our religions, which are often desperate attempts to call the gods back, to recreate the conditions of their presence through ritual and prayer. We build our churches and mosques and temples in the image of the mountains they once inhabited. We perform ceremonies that echo the daily care and feeding of the cult statues in ancient Babylon. We wait for a return, a second coming, a moment when the heavens will open once again, and our creators will descend to fix the world we have broken in their absence. This longing for a divine return is a fundamental part of the human psyche, a recurring theme in almost every culture on Earth. Whether we call it the return of the gods, the coming of the Messiah, or contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, the underlying impulse is the same. We are looking for our parents. We are looking for the source of our mixed identity. To understand what happened to the Anunnaki, we must accept that they did not have to stay physically present to rule us. Their departure was the ultimate act of colonization. They did not leave us to be free. They left us to be their representatives, their caretakers, the living monuments to their existence. We are the evidence of their stay. Our languages, our laws, our sciences, and our very bodies are the artifacts they left behind. When we study the ancient tablets, we are not just looking at the history of a vanished civilization. We are looking at our own blueprints. We are reading the manual for a machine that we are still trying to understand. Mainstream scholars will tell you that this is all a projection, that we take our own human anxieties and achievements and cast them onto the screen of the past, creating gods to explain things we did not yet understand. They argue that the Anunnaki were a brilliant invention of the Sumerian mind, a way to make sense of the transition from nomadic life to urban civilization. And in many ways, they are right. The Anunnaki are a mirror. When we look at them, we see our own potential and our own darkness. We see our capacity for great order and our tendency toward devastating conflict. We see our hunger for knowledge and our fear of the unknown. But the mirror is not empty. There is a resonance between the ancient stories and our modern reality that is difficult to ignore. As we decode the human genome, as we launch probes toward distant planets, as we build artificial intelligences that mimic our own consciousness, we find ourselves reenacting the very myths we once thought were just stories. We are becoming the Anunnaki. We are learning how to manipulate life, how to travel between worlds, how to decree the fates of entire species. If we were created in their image, then our destiny is to follow in their footsteps. Perhaps the reason the gods left was to see if their creation could eventually join them among the stars. Perhaps our entire history is a long, slow maturation process, an evolution from the Lulu workers of the Abzu to the celestial voyagers of the future. The question of what remains in our DNA is ultimately a question of potential. Are we merely biological accidents, or are we a project in progress? The answer lies in the silence between the stars and in the complexity of the double helix. It is written in the geometry of our cities and the rhythm of our clocks. The Anunnaki may have withdrawn their physical presence, but they left behind a world that is shaped by their logic and a species that is haunted by their memory. We are the legacy of the stars. We are the mixed ones. And as we continue to descend into the mysteries of our past, we are simultaneously ascending toward a future where we may finally meet our creators on equal terms. The ziggurats are silent, but our laboratories are humming. The clay tablets are broken, but our digital archives are expanding. The gods have departed the temples, but they have taken up residence in our ambitions. To know where they went, we only have to look at where we are going. We are the continuation of their story. We are the final segment of their long journey on this planet. And as we prepare to take our own first steps into the deep ocean of space, we carry the flesh and blood of the gods with us. We are the children of the stars, returning to the source from which we came. The haunting absence that we felt in the beginning of our journey, that unsettling silence in the ruins of Uruk, is finally being filled, not by the return of alien spacecraft, but by the awakening of human consciousness to its own extraordinary nature. We are the revelation we have been waiting for. We are the answer to the mystery of the Anunnaki. Their legacy is not found in hidden chambers or buried artifacts, but in the simple fact of our existence, our survival, and our relentless quest to understand the universe and our place within it. The stars are not just above us. They are within us. And the journey that began 50,000 years ago in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia is now leading us back to the heavens from which the gods first ascended. The ziggurats are silent, but our laboratories are humming. The clay tablets are broken, but our digital archives are expanding. The gods have departed the temples, but they have taken up residence in our ambitions. To know where they went, we only have to look at where we are going. We are the continuation of their story. We are the final segment of their long journey on this planet. And as we prepare to take our own first steps into the deep ocean of space, we carry the flesh and blood of the gods with us. We are the children of the stars, returning to the source from which we came. The haunting absence that we felt in the beginning of our journey, that unsettling silence in the ruins of Uruk, is finally being filled, not by the return of alien spacecraft, but by the awakening of human consciousness to its own extraordinary nature. We are the revelation we have been waiting for. We are the answer to the mystery of the Anunnaki. Their legacy is not found in hidden chambers or buried artifacts, but in the simple fact of our existence, our survival, and our relentless quest to understand the universe and our place within it. The stars are not just above us. They are within us. And the journey that began 50,000 years ago in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia is now leading us back to the heavens from which the gods first descended. Prepare yourself for the final revelations as we close this chapter of our history. The path from the Sumerian temples to the modern spaceport is a single line, a continuous thread of human aspiration and divine inspiration. We have walked the ruins and read the tablets. We have explored the myths and questioned the science. Now, as the sun sets on the age of the gods, we stand at the dawn of the age of humanity, a species that remembers its past, understands its present, and is ready to claim its future among the stars. Thank you for walking this path with us. The revelations are here. The legacy is ours. Let us begin the final ascent.